The road to Ashcombe Manor was longer than Eleanor Whitmore had imagined. For nearly 4 hours, the carriage had climbed gentle hills, crossed narrow stone bridges, and wound through ancient forests where towering oaks hid the afternoon sun. The farther they traveled into Northumberland, the quieter the world became. Villages disappeared. Inns became rare. Even the birds seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness that settled over the countryside. The coachman finally pointed ahead with his whip. "There, miss." Eleanor leaned toward the small carriage window. At first she saw nothing except gray mist. Then the manor emerged. It rose above the cliffs like something built centuries before the modern world had learned to hurry. Massive walls of weathered stone caught the pale afternoon light. Ivy climbed its towers. Hundreds of narrow windows reflected the silver sea beyond. It was not beautiful in the cheerful way London houses were beautiful. It possessed another kind of beauty, older, sadder, the kind that had survived generations of joy and generations of grief. Eleanor quietly folded the letter resting in her lap. Ashcombe Manor. Companion required for the Dowager Duchess Margaret Ashcombe. Quiet temperament preferred. Salary, £100 per year. £100. Her late father had never earned half that amount. Only 6 months earlier she had been the daughter of a respected village schoolmaster. Now she owned 2 dresses, 1 small leather suitcase, a silver locket containing her parents' miniature portraits, and exactly £17. Life had a strange way of changing everything between one season and the next. The carriage slowed. The enormous iron gates slowly opened. 2 stone wolves guarded either side of the entrance. The coachman crossed himself. Eleanor noticed. "Is something wrong?" The old man hesitated. "Nothing, miss." He paused. "Only, they say the real wolves are much larger." She looked at him. "Wolves. The Duke keeps 2 Irish wolfhounds. I've never seen animals like them. They don't bark. They judge." Eleanor smiled politely. "I imagine dogs are kinder judges than people." The coachman laughed quietly. "You may be the first lady to say that." The carriage stopped before the manor. A tall, elderly butler descended the front steps. His silver hair matched the morning mist. He opened the carriage door himself. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore?" "Yes." He bowed. "Welcome to Ashcombe Manor." His voice carried perfect dignity. Yet behind it, Eleanor heard exhaustion, the kind that comes from serving a household where laughter has long since disappeared. A young maid carried Eleanor's suitcase inside. She looked almost embarrassed by its size. Most ladies who visited the Duke apparently arrived with 6 or 7 trunks. Eleanor possessed only 1. The butler noticed. His eyes softened. "This way, miss." The entrance hall stole her breath. Marble floors stretched beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Portraits of Ashcombe dukes watched silently from walls that reached nearly 3 stories high. Every painting seemed darker than the last. Men in military uniforms, women wearing pearls, children holding books, generations of one family. Every face carried the same quiet dignity. Yet none appeared truly happy. The house felt strangely cold despite the roaring fireplaces. Not physically cold, emotionally, as though sorrow had become another piece of furniture. The butler led her into a drawing room overlooking the gardens. "Her Grace will join you shortly." He quietly closed the door. Eleanor wandered toward the window. Outside, rows of rose gardens stretched across the grounds. Or rather, what had once been rose gardens. The flowers had long disappeared. Weeds covered the paths. Stone fountains stood dry. Nature had slowly reclaimed everything. Someone had loved this garden once. Now, no one did. The door opened softly. An elegant woman entered. Her black silk dress reflected the afternoon sunlight. Though well into her 60s, she carried herself with unmistakable grace. "Miss Whitmore." Eleanor curtsied. "Your Grace." The Dowager Duchess smiled gently. "Mr. Hargreaves described you exactly. I'm afraid I don't know what he wrote." "He wrote," the older woman studied her for several moments, "that you know how to be quiet without making silence uncomfortable." Eleanor blinked. "That's a rather unusual compliment." "It is." The Duchess laughed softly. and exactly the quality this house requires. She invited Eleanor to sit. Tea arrived. For nearly 20 minutes they spoke about ordinary things. Books, weather, village life. The dowager asked very few personal questions. Instead, she watched, observed, as though trying to understand not Eleanor's answers, but the person giving them. Finally, she asked one last question. Do you fear large dogs? Eleanor looked surprised. I've never met one. So you don't know. I suppose not. The Duchess nodded thoughtfully. We shall discover soon enough. A strange sound echoed through the hallway. Not footsteps. Something heavier. Rhythmic. Click, click, click. Claws against polished marble. The Dowager Duchess slowly looked toward the doorway. So, they've found you? Eleanor frowned. They? Before anyone could answer, two enormous Irish wolfhounds entered the drawing room. The larger one was silver gray, the second almost entirely black. They were unlike any dogs Eleanor had ever imagined. Both stood nearly waist-high. Their movements were silent, controlled, powerful. Neither barked, neither rushed toward her. They simply looked. The maid carrying fresh tea froze completely. A footman outside the door quietly whispered, "Oh no!" The silver hound approached first. One slow step, then another, stopping only inches away. Eleanor remained seated. Her heartbeat quickened, but she remembered something her father had once told her. Animals rarely fear honesty. She slowly lifted one hand, not toward the dog, simply resting it upon her lap where he could see it. The wolfhound leaned forward. His warm breath touched her fingers. He sniffed quietly. The room became perfectly still. Everyone waited. The growl, the rejection. Instead, the giant hound gently lowered his head into Eleanor's lap. The black wolfhound immediately followed. He lay at her feet with a satisfied sigh. The maid gasped. The footman crossed himself. The Dowager Duchess whispered, "No, it cannot be." At that exact moment, another voice entered the room. Deep, calm, authoritative. Atlas. The silver wolfhound lifted his head, but did not move. Eleanor slowly looked toward the doorway. A tall man stood there, dark riding coat, wind-tossed black hair, eyes the color of a winter sea. He couldn't have been much older than 34. Yet grief had added years no calendar ever counted. This could only be one man, His Grace, Adrian Ashcombe, 8th Duke of Ashcombe. He looked first at the dogs, then at Eleanor, then back to the dogs. For the first time in many years, his perfectly controlled expression cracked, not into a smile, into disbelief, because Atlas and Orion, the two wolfhounds who had rejected every noble woman in England, had chosen a poor schoolmaster's daughter within minutes of meeting her. And in that single impossible moment, neither Adrian nor Eleanor realized that both of their lives had just changed forever. The silence lingered long after the Duke entered the drawing room. No one moved, not the maid, not the footman, not even the Dowager Duchess. Atlas still rested his enormous head upon Eleanor's lap, while Orion lay comfortably beside her chair, his long tail sweeping lazily across the Persian carpet. It was impossible. For nearly 4 years, the two wolfhounds had greeted every visitor in exactly the same way. They watched, they judged, and if they disapproved, they made certain everyone knew. Yet today, neither dog showed the slightest hesitation. They had accepted Eleanor as though she had always belonged at Ashcombe Manor. Adrian looked from one hound to the other. His voice remained calm. Atlas, the silver-gray wolfhound, slowly lifted his head. For one hopeful moment, the servants believed he would obey. Instead, Atlas merely looked toward his master, then calmly placed his head back upon Eleanor's knees. A faint ripple of shock spread across the room. The Duke stared. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he sighed. Well, I suppose I've been replaced. The remark was so unexpectedly dry that Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, almost smiled before quickly composing herself. The Dowager Duchess hid a laugh behind her teacup. My dear, it appears your dogs have developed independent opinions. They always had. Adrian answered quietly. They simply haven't shared one this enthusiastically before. The first conversation. Eleanor slowly stood. Atlas rose immediately. So did Orion. Both dogs remained close enough that their shoulders brushed against her dress. She looked uncertain. I hope I haven't done anything inappropriate. No. The Duke's eyes remained fixed upon the wolfhounds. You've done something no one else has managed. She hesitated. I'm afraid I don't understand. Neither do I. Their eyes met for first time. Eleanor expected arrogance. After all, he was one of England's most powerful noblemen. Instead, she found something entirely different. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. The quiet weariness of someone who had carried sorrow far longer than anyone should. The Duke finally extended his hand. Adrian Ashcombe. She looked surprised. Most noblemen introduced themselves by title, not by name. She accepted his hand. Eleanor Whitmore. His handshake was brief, respectful, without ceremony. Then Atlas pushed his enormous head between them. The wolfhound gently nudged Adrian's arm aside before returning to Eleanor. For the first time in years, the Duke laughed. Only once, only softly. But the sound echoed through the drawing room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Every servant looked up. Mrs. Hargreaves felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. She had not heard that laugh since before Lord William died. The house itself seemed to pause, as though Ashcombe Manor had almost forgotten what laughter sounded like. The Dowager Duchess rose gracefully. I imagine Miss Whitmore would like to see her room. Of course. Adrian stepped aside. I'll leave you to settle in. He turned toward the doorway. Atlas did not follow. Neither did Orion. The Duke stopped, looked over his shoulder. The two wolfhounds remained seated beside Eleanor, watching him leave. He shook his head with quiet amusement. Traitors. Atlas wagged his tail. The Dowager smiled. I've always suspected they like someone more than you. I simply never expected to meet her. Without another word, he left the room. Ashcombe Manor possessed over 100 rooms. Most had remained closed for years. Eleanor's chamber overlooked the eastern gardens. It wasn't luxurious by noble standards, but to her, it felt almost unbelievable. A four-poster bed, a writing desk beside the window, fresh flowers, a small fireplace already burning, one entire wall filled with bookshelves. She slowly placed her suitcase upon the bed. Everything she owned looked strangely insignificant inside. Such a beautiful room. The Dowager watched quietly. You expected something smaller. I expected an attic. The older woman laughed. We reserve attics for trunks. Eleanor smiled. I've only one. I notice. The Duchess sat beside the window. For some people, a single suitcase tells a very long story. Eleanor looked down. It does, but not one worth telling. The Duchess disagreed. I believe all quiet people have interesting stories. They simply choose them carefully. That evening, Eleanor met the household. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, Mr. Collins, the butler, Mr. Fletcher, the head gardener, Mrs. Doyle, the cook, 2 footmen, 3 maids, a stable master. No unnecessary servants. No lavish display. Only those a family truly needed. Everyone welcomed her politely. Yet Eleanor noticed something unusual. Whenever the Duke's name appeared in conversation, voices became softer. Smiles disappeared. The house revolved around him. But no one quite knew how to reach him anymore. Unable to sleep that night, Eleanor wandered quietly downstairs. The manor seemed almost magical beneath moonlight. Candles flickered along endless corridors. Portraits appeared alive in the shifting shadows. Following instinct rather than direction, she eventually discovered the library. It was magnificent. Thousands of leather-bound books reached toward a painted ceiling. A ladder rolled silently along polished oak shelves. The scent of old paper and cedar filled the room. She stepped inside. This may be the most beautiful room I've ever seen. You aren't the first to say that. She turned quickly. The Duke sat beside the fireplace. A book rested open upon his lap. Atlas slept at his feet. Orion lay near the window. Neither dog appeared surprised to see Eleanor. "I apologize. I didn't realize anyone was here. I often come here when I can't sleep." She hesitated. "I can leave." "You needn't." He closed his book. The library belongs to everyone. Eleanor chose a novel from the nearest shelf. Without another word, she settled into an armchair opposite him. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Neither spoke. Only pages turned quietly. The fire crackled softly. Rain tapped against the windows. It should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt peaceful. The kind of silence shared only between people who had no need to impress one another. Finally, Adrian looked up from his book. "You read quickly." "My father believed books should never wait. A wise man." He was. Silence returned. Comfortable once again. Later, from a hallway outside the library, the Dowager Duchess stood unseen. She watched the two young people reading beside the fire. Neither smiled. Neither flirted. Neither even looked at one another. Yet, the room felt warmer than it had in years. Mr. Collins quietly joined her. "They've not spoken for nearly 40 minutes. "I know." The butler looked confused. "Should one of us announce supper?" The Duchess slowly shook her head. "No, leave them. For the first time in 4 years. My son isn't reading because he's hiding." She looked through the half-open door once more. "He's reading because someone else is sharing the silence." A single tear escaped before she could stop it. Perhaps, just perhaps, Ashcombe Manor had not forgotten how to smile after all. Morning arrived quietly at Ashcombe Manor. The mist rolled gently across the cliffs, softening the sharp edges of the old estate, until the manor looked less like a great noble house and more like a forgotten memory, waiting for someone to remember it. The servants had already begun their work long before sunrise. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimneys. The stable boys brushed the horses. Mrs. Doyle filled the house with the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. For the first time in many years, someone was humming. Mrs. Hargreaves stopped halfway down the corridor. She listened carefully. It was one of the kitchen maids. A simple country melody. The old housekeeper smiled to herself. Ashcombe Manor had been silent for so long that even a quiet song sounded like a miracle. Eleanor soon discovered that breakfast followed strict tradition. The Dowager Duchess sat at one end of the long oak table. The Duke usually occupied the other. Between them stretched enough empty space to seat another dozen guests. Yet only 3 people dined there. The room felt far too large for such a small family. Mr. Collins poured tea with practiced elegance. Mrs. Doyle personally carried warm bread to the table. Atlas and Orion lay quietly beside the fireplace. Adrian entered precisely at 8. He greeted his mother with a polite nod. "Good morning." "And to you, my dear." Then he acknowledged Eleanor. "Miss Whitmore." "Your Grace." He sat down. Breakfast continued in silence. Not uncomfortable. Simply familiar. The Duke read a newspaper while drinking coffee. The Dowager spread marmalade across her toast. Eleanor quietly admired the view beyond the tall windows. She noticed something strange. Beyond the eastern lawn, the abandoned rose garden glowed beneath the morning sun, even covered with weeds. It remained beautiful, as though refusing to surrender entirely. She couldn't stop looking at it. The Duke noticed. "Do you enjoy gardens?" She turned slightly. "My father grew roses." He believed flowers could make even ordinary homes feel important. Adrian looked toward the forgotten garden. "My brother believed something similar." The conversation ended there, but Eleanor remembered the sadness in his voice. After breakfast, the Dowager suggested a walk. "You should become familiar with the grounds." Eleanor gladly agreed. The estate covered thousands of acres. Ancient oak trees lined winding paths. A crystal-clear stream crossed the southern meadow. Wildflowers covered gentle hills overlooking the sea. Everything seemed peaceful, everything except the rose garden. Now that she stood before it, she understood why it had captured her attention. It wasn't merely neglected. It had been abandoned. Hundreds of rose bushes stood tangled beneath years of unchecked growth. Stone benches leaned crookedly beneath climbing ivy. The fountain no longer held water. Dead vines wrapped around marble statues. Nature had reclaimed what grief had left behind. Eleanor knelt beside a single white rose. It was the only flower still blooming. Tiny, fragile, yet determined, she carefully removed several weeds growing around its roots. She hadn't noticed someone watching. Careful, an elderly voice startled her. The roots are deeper than they appear. Eleanor stood immediately. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched anything. The old man smiled kindly. No apology necessary. I only meant. He knelt beside the rose. She's stubborn. You speak as though she's alive. Mr. Fletcher chuckled. Every gardener eventually does. He gently brushed dirt away from the stem. This was Lord William's favorite rose. The Duke's brother? Yes. He planted this himself. Eleanor looked around. Did he plant all of them? The old gardener nodded proudly. Nearly every rose in this garden. He was only 16 when he started. It took him 4 summers. She looked across the vast garden with new understanding. He must have loved this place. Mr. Fletcher's smile faded. He did. The day he disappeared. The Duke never returned here. Silence settled between them. The old gardener sighed. I asked permission to restore it many times. And His Grace always said no. Why? Mr. Fletcher looked toward the manor, because if the garden changed, it would mean accepting that Lord William wasn't coming back to finish it. Footsteps approached quietly across the gravel path. Neither Eleanor nor the gardener heard them. Adrian stopped several feet away. His gaze rested upon the white rose, then upon Eleanor's dirt-covered gloves. You've been gardening. She looked slightly embarrassed, only for a few moments. I hope you don't mind. The Duke walked slowly toward the flower bed. He stared at the single white bloom. My brother called these his promise roses. Promise roses? He planted white roses every time he made a promise. Eleanor smiled gently. What sort of promises? When we were children? A faint smile touched Adrian's face. Ridiculous ones. He promised never to grow taller than me. He promised Mother he'd stop climbing the clock tower. He promised Father he'd become serious. The smile disappeared. He broke every promise. Except one. Eleanor waited. He looked toward the sea. He promised his garden would bloom every spring. His voice had grown quieter. It hasn't bloomed since he vanished. The wind moved softly through branches. No one spoke. Finally, Eleanor looked back at the struggling white rose. Perhaps, she said carefully, it's only waiting. The Duke looked at her. Waiting? For someone willing to care for it again. He said nothing, but her words remained with him. That afternoon, they met once more in the library. Neither had planned it. Adrian sat beside the fire reading estate reports. Eleanor selected a volume of poetry from the upper shelf. Without thinking, she climbed the rolling ladder. It moved unexpectedly. Her balance shifted. The book slipped from her hands. Before she could fall, a steady hand caught her arm. She looked down. The Duke stood below. His grip remained firm but gentle. Careful. She laughed nervously. I seem determined to embarrass myself. I've seen far worse. You have? I once watched my brother attempt to climb that ladder while carrying 6 books. And he succeeded. She smiled. Really? No. He fell into a chair. For the second time, Eleanor heard the Duke laugh. This time, the sound lasted longer. Not much. Perhaps only 2 seconds. Yet Mrs. Hargreaves, passing outside the library, stopped in astonishment. She quietly covered her mouth. Later that evening, she whispered to Mr. Collins, I heard him laugh. The old butler looked at her. Are you certain? I've served this family 29 years. I know the Duke's laugh. Mr. Collins slowly smiled. Then, perhaps, our young guest has brought something back that all the doctors fail to find. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Atlas and Orion wandered into the rose garden alone. Mr. Fletcher happened to be locking away his tools. He watched with curiosity. The 2 great wolfhounds stopped beside the single white rose. Atlas lay quietly beneath the old stone arch. Orion settled beside him. They remained there, watching the path Eleanor had taken back toward the house. The old gardener smiled. "So, you've chosen her too." Atlas closed his eyes. The answer needed no words. Long after everyone had gone to bed, Adrian stood alone beside his bedroom window. Moonlight bathed the forgotten garden. He noticed something unusual immediately. The weeds around the white rose had already been cleared. Only a small corner, barely noticeable. Yet, somehow, the flower stood taller than it had that morning. He remembered Eleanor's words. Perhaps it's only waiting. For the first time in years, the Duke found himself wondering what the garden might look like if someone believed it could bloom again, and somewhere deep inside him, a part of his own heart, quietly wondered the very same thing. The first frost arrived 3 mornings later. Thin crystals of ice clung to the edges of the rose leaves, turning the forgotten garden into a sea of silver beneath the rising sun. The fountains remained silent, the marble statues cold to touch, and the sea beyond the cliffs rolled beneath a blanket of pale mist. Eleanor wrapped her wool shawl tightly around her shoulders as she crossed the eastern terrace. She had begun waking before everyone else, not because anyone expected it, simply because she loved the quiet. The world seemed more honest before breakfast. She carried a small basket containing nothing more than gardening gloves, pruning scissors Mr. Fletcher had lent her, and a tiny notebook where she carefully wrote the names of every rose she discovered beneath years of tangled vines. She had never intended to restore the garden. She merely wanted to help one flower survive. Yet, somehow, one flower had become 5. 5 had become 12. And every morning another forgotten rose greeted the sunlight. High above the garden, Adrian stood beside the window of his study. He should have been reviewing his state accounts. Instead, his attention remained fixed upon the small figure, moving quietly among the roses. She never hurried, never complained, never called servants to help. She simply knelt beside each neglected bush, patiently removing dead branches before moving to the next. It was remarkable, not because she knew so much about gardening, but because she expected nothing in return. She never looked toward the manor to see if anyone was watching. She believed she was completely alone. The Duke found himself smiling without realizing it. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Mr. Collins entered carrying the morning correspondence. He noticed immediately where Adrian was looking. The roses seemed healthier. "They do. The gardener says Miss Whitmore has worked every morning." Adrian remained silent. After a moment, he asked, "Has she requested assistance?" "No, Your Grace." "Recognition?" "No." "Anything?" Mr. Collins smiled gently. "Only permission to borrow another pair of gardening gloves." The Duke looked back toward the garden. "So she truly expects nothing?" "No, sir. I don't believe she does." During breakfast, the Dowager Duchess unfolded a cream-colored envelope bearing an elegant wax seal. She sighed almost immediately. Adrian looked up. "Bad news?" "Not exactly." She handed him the letter. He read only the first few lines before placing it back on the table. "They're coming." "I'm afraid so." Eleanor looked between them. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Who is coming?" The Duchess smiled apologetically. "Old friends. Lady Beatrice Ravenshire and her daughter." Adrian quietly reached for his coffee. "When?" "This afternoon." He said nothing more, but Eleanor noticed something she had never seen before. Disappointment, not irritation, not annoyance, just resignation, as though he already knew exactly how the visit would unfold. Later that morning, Mrs. Hargreaves found Eleanor arranging books in the morning room. "You seem curious." "A little. About our visitors?" Eleanor nodded. The older woman hesitated before answering. "Lady Charlotte Ravenshire has visited Ashcombe Manor many times. The Duke knows her well. They grew up together. And—" Mrs. Hargreaves smiled sadly. "The whole of London has expected them to marry for nearly 5 years. Eleanor looked down at the book in her hands. "I see. Do you?" The housekeeper studied her kindly. "Society often mistakes convenience for affection. I've learned not to. By early afternoon, The sound of approaching carriage wheels echoed across the courtyard. Footmen hurried to the entrance. Mr. Collins straightened his gloves. The Dowager Duchess descended the staircase with perfect dignity. Adrian stood beside the fireplace. His expression revealed nothing. The front doors opened. Lady Beatrice Ravenshire entered first. Elegant, graceful, every movement reflected decades spent in the highest circles of English society. Beside her walked her daughter, Lady Charlotte. She was beautiful, not merely attractive, beautiful in the effortless way portrait painters attempted to capture, but rarely succeeded. Golden hair rested beneath a fashionable velvet hat. Her emerald traveling gown had clearly been designed in Paris. Pearls shimmered softly at her neck. When she smiled, the entire entrance hall seemed brighter. She crossed directly toward Adrian. "Your Grace." He bowed politely. "Lady Charlotte." She laughed. "Must we still be so formal?" He answered with the smallest smile. "I've found formality prevents misunderstandings." Her smile faltered, only for a moment. Then it returned. "Some things never change." "No, they don't." The introductions followed naturally. When Eleanor stepped forward, Charlotte looked at her with pleasant curiosity. "And this must be Miss Whitmore, the new companion." The Dowager nodded. "She has been with us nearly 2 weeks." Charlotte extended her hand warmly. "How lovely to meet you." Eleanor accepted it. "The pleasure is mine." Charlotte's manners were flawless, her smile sincere. There was no arrogance, no cruelty, no condescension. If anything, she seemed genuinely kind. That surprised Eleanor. She had expected rivalry. Instead, she found grace. Tea was served in the sunroom overlooking the gardens. Conversation flowed easily. Charlotte possessed remarkable charm. She told amusing stories from London, spoke of concerts, charity galas, and royal receptions. Even Adrian answered more than usual, not because he enjoyed such conversations, simply because he had known her almost his entire life. Eleanor listened quietly, watching more than speaking. She noticed something curious. Whenever Charlotte addressed Adrian, she leaned slightly toward him. Whenever Adrian replied, he remained politely distant. There was respect between them, comfort, history, but something important was missing. Mrs. Hargreaves noticed it too. She quietly caught Mr. Collins' eye across the room. The old butler understood immediately. Nothing had changed. The Duke remained exactly as distant with Lady Charlotte as he had always been. That evening, Charlotte wandered into the eastern garden alone. She found Eleanor kneeling beside a newly uncovered rose bush. "You truly enjoy this." Eleanor looked up. "I do." Charlotte smiled. "I never had the patience." She looked around the neglected garden. "It used to be extraordinary. You remember it? We played here as children." Her expression softened. "William planted that white rose." She pointed toward the oldest bush. "He insisted every rose should have a name." "What did he call this one?" Charlotte laughed quietly. "Hope." Eleanor looked at the flower. The name suited it perfectly. Charlotte watched her for a long moment. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you love flowers? Or are you trying to heal someone?" The question caught Eleanor completely by surprise. She lowered her eyes. "I don't think people can be healed by someone else." "No, I think." She gently brushed soil from her gloves. "They can only be reminded that healing is still possible." Charlotte remained silent. Then, very softly, she smiled. "I was right." "About what?" "You really are different." As twilight settled over Ashcombe Manor, Charlotte found Adrian standing on the western terrace overlooking the sea. "Still hiding from parties?" He smiled faintly. "I've become rather skilled at it." She joined him beside the stone railing. "For years, Mother believed we'd marry." "I know. And you?" He looked toward the horizon. "I never wish to disappoint anyone. But kindness and love are not the same thing." Charlotte nodded slowly. "I think I always knew." A peaceful silence followed. Finally, she laughed softly. "So, has she realized yet?" Adrian frowned. "Who?" Charlotte looked toward the rose garden, where Eleanor was still gathering her tools. "The woman your wolves have already chosen." The Duke followed her gaze. He watched Eleanor laugh quietly with Mr. Fletcher over something neither of them could hear. Without realizing it, he smiled. A real smile, Charlotte noticed. And in that moment, she understood everything. There had never been room in Adrian's heart for her. Not because it was closed forever, because, without either of them noticing, it had quietly begun opening for someone else. She felt the smallest ache inside her chest. Then she smiled, not sadly, hopefully. Perhaps this was exactly the ending Ashcombe Manor had been waiting for. The first Saturday of October had always been special at Ashcombe Manor, long before Adrian became Duke, long before sorrow settled over the estate. The Ashcombe family hosted a simple harvest evening for everyone who worked on the land. It was not a grand ball. No royal guests attended. No orchestra from London performed. It was simply one evening each year when noblemen, gardeners, stable boys, maids, cooks, and tenant farmers gathered beneath strings of lanterns to celebrate another successful harvest. The late Duke had believed that a house was only as strong as the people who cared for it. So once every autumn, the great doors of Ashcombe Manor opened to everyone. After Lord William's disappearance, the celebration quietly disappeared. No one mentioned it again. No one dared point 3 days before the festival. The Dowager Duchess found Adrian in the library. He sat beside the fire, reviewing estate accounts while Atlas slept across his boots. She closed the door behind her. "We should hold the harvest evening this year." Adrian did not immediately answer. "It has been 4 years. I know. The people miss it. So do I." He slowly closed the ledger. "It doesn't feel right. When has grief ever asked permission to steal another happy memory?" The words lingered between them. She walked toward the window. William adored that evening. He danced with every maid who was too frightened to ask. He convinced the stable boys to sing. He even persuaded your father to play the violin once. A faint smile touched Adrian's lips. "I remember." The Dowager looked at him carefully. "If William were standing here today, what would he tell you?" Adrian already knew the answer. Stop hiding. His younger brother had always said exactly what everyone else avoided. He sighed quietly. "Very well. We'll celebrate." The Dowager's face brightened. For the first time in years, hope entered Ashcombe Manor. The entire estate came alive. Gardeners hung lanterns between ancient oak trees. Stable boys polished wooden benches. Mrs. Doyle planned enough food for nearly 200 people. Fresh apple pies cooled upon every kitchen table. The old musicians from a nearby village were invited once again. Even the weather seemed to approve. The gray skies cleared. Golden autumn sunlight covered the fields. Ashcombe Manor looked warmer than Eleanor had ever seen it. She helped Mrs. Hargreaves decorate the great hall with dried flowers, autumn leaves, and ribbons in deep crimson and gold. "It's beautiful." Mrs. Hargreaves smiled. "It used to be even grander." She adjusted a garland. "But perhaps smaller celebrations are sometimes happier." That afternoon, the Dowager Duchess knocked gently on Eleanor's bedroom door. "I have something for you." She carried a long cream-colored box tied with blue silk ribbon. Eleanor looked confused. "Your Grace, I couldn't possibly accept. You haven't seen it yet." The older woman lifted the lid. Inside rested a gown of soft midnight blue. Simple, elegant, no excessive lace, no jewels, only delicate embroidery of tiny silver roses along the sleeves. Eleanor stared speechlessly. "It's beautiful. It belonged to my daughter." The room became quiet. "I had a daughter." The Duchess smiled sadly. "She died when she was 18. I've kept the dress all these years." She gently touched the fabric. "I think she would have wanted someone to wear it again." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't." The Duchess smiled warmly. "Simply promise you'll enjoy the evening." "I promise." Across the corridor, Lady Charlotte stood outside her own room, adjusting the ribbons on her gown. Her maid admired the reflection. "You will be the most beautiful lady there." Charlotte smiled. Beauty isn't always the most interesting thing in a room. She remembered the way Adrian had smiled while watching Eleanor in the rose garden, not because Eleanor dazzled anyone, because she made silence feel peaceful. Charlotte quietly sighed. Perhaps she had already lost a competition she had never truly entered. Oddly, the realization no longer hurt as the sun disappeared behind the western hills. Hundreds of lanterns illuminated the manor gardens. Music drifted through the crisp autumn air. Children laughed while chasing one another between apple trees. Farmers greeted servants like old friends. The great hall echoed with conversation once again. For the first time in 4 years, Ashcombe Manor felt alive. Adrian stood near the entrance greeting estate workers personally. Every man received a handshake. Every elderly woman a respectful bow. No titles, no distance, only gratitude. Eleanor watched quietly from across the room. She had never imagined a duke could seem so ordinary. Mr. Collins appeared beside her. You've never seen him like this. No, neither have we. When Eleanor descended the grand staircase, conversation throughout the hall slowly faded. Not because she wore jewels. She wore none. Not because the dress was extravagant. It wasn't. The midnight blue gown suited her so naturally that it seemed as though it had been waiting years for its true owner. Atlas looked up first. Then Orion. Both giant wolfhounds crossed the crowded hall without hesitation. They stopped beside Eleanor. Atlas sat proudly. Orion rested against her skirts. Several guests laughed softly. They've chosen their favorite again. The dowager smiled. I believe they have. Across the room, Adrian looked up. For several long seconds, he forgot every conversation around him. The lantern light caught the silver embroidery upon Eleanor's sleeves. She looked nothing like a companion, nothing like a servant. She simply belonged. Lady Charlotte quietly noticed his expression. She smiled to herself. There was again that look, the one Adrian didn't realize he wore. The village musicians finished another lively country tune. An elderly violinist stepped forward. My lord. He bowed toward Adrian. It has long been tradition that the Duke opens the first dance. The entire hall became quiet. Everyone remembered. For 4 years, the Duke had refused. Adrian looked toward the musicians, then toward his mother, then toward Eleanor. She immediately lowered her eyes. Surely, he would ask Lady Charlotte. That was what everyone expected. Lady Charlotte herself believed so. She even prepared to step forward. Instead, Adrian crossed the hall, stopped before Eleanor, extended his hand. Miss Whitmore. She looked up, startled. Would you honor me with the first dance? The room fell utterly silent. A serving tray nearly slipped from one maid's hands. Mrs. Doyle covered her mouth. Mr. Fletcher blinked twice. Even Lady Charlotte looked genuinely surprised. Eleanor hesitated. Your Grace, I don't dance particularly well. A faint smile appeared on Adrian's face. Fortunately, neither do I. Soft laughter spread across the hall. She slowly placed her hand in his. I would be honored. The music began. Slow, gentle. The kind of melody that seemed written for quiet conversations rather than grand performances. Adrian rested one hand lightly against Eleanor's back. The other held hers carefully. Neither spoke at first. They simply moved together beneath the lantern light. After a few moments, Eleanor smiled nervously. You were right. I'm not. No. She looked down. I truly don't dance well. He chuckled. I've stepped on your dress twice. Only twice. So far. For the first time in years. The Duke laughed openly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Simply, honestly. The sound filled the hall. Mrs. Hargreaves quietly wiped away a tear. Mr. Collins looked toward the ceiling. If you're watching, young master, he whispered almost silently, I think you'd approve. Across the room, Lady Charlotte watched the couple glide beneath the lanterns. There was no jealousy left, only understanding. Some people fell in love through grand declarations. Others, through shared silence, shared gardens, shared books, and one simple dance. As the final note faded, Neither Adrian nor Eleanor realized that every servant in Ashcombe Manor had been smiling, because for one beautiful evening, the manor had remembered what happiness looked like, and somewhere beyond the music, the forgotten rose garden waited quietly beneath the moonlight, preparing to bloom once more. The morning after the harvest evening felt different. Ashcombe Manor was quieter than usual, not with the silence of sorrow, but with the gentle stillness that follows genuine happiness. The lanterns had been taken down. The musicians had returned to their village. Only scattered autumn leaves remained across the courtyard, dancing in the cool morning breeze. For the first time in 4 years, the servants greeted one another with smiles that lingered a little longer than before. Mrs. Hargreaves noticed it immediately. "So," she whispered to Mr. Collins while arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall, "the house remembers." The old butler looked toward the grand staircase. "No, it remembers how it used to feel." Eleanor carried a small basket through the eastern garden just after sunrise. She had grown fond of this quiet hour before breakfast. The world belonged only to birdsong, the whisper of leaves, and the distant rhythm of the sea. She knelt beside the oldest white rose. The one William had named Hope. Tiny new shoots had appeared around its stem. She smiled. "You really were waiting." A familiar voice answered behind her. "So were we." She turned. The Duke stood beneath the stone archway, holding 2 steaming cups. "I wasn't sure whether you preferred tea or coffee." She accepted one gratefully. "Tea." "I guessed correctly." "You did." For several peaceful moments they stood without speaking, watching sunlight slowly warm the sleeping garden. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "Mr. Fletcher tells me you've rescued nearly 40 rose bushes. I've only removed the weeds. You've done much more than that." She looked down. "I don't think flowers bloom because of gardeners. No, they bloom because they were meant to." He watched her thoughtfully. "And people—" She hesitated. "I think people are much more stubborn." The Duke laughed softly. "I can't argue with that." Just before noon, Mr. Collins entered the drawing room, carrying the Morning Post. "Miss Whitmore, a letter for you." Eleanor looked surprised. Very few people knew where she was. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Mrs. Agnes Bennet, her father's closest friend, the woman who had practically raised her after her mother's death. She quietly excused herself, taking the letter to the library where she could read in peace. Her smile disappeared after the first paragraph. "My dearest Eleanor, I hesitated before writing this, but I believe you deserve to know what is being said in the village. Someone returning from Ashcombe Manor claims the Duke danced with his mother's companion during the harvest evening. People have already begun talking. You know how cruel society can be. Please be careful, my dear. A gentleman's reputation can survive gossip. A young lady's often cannot. And whatever your feelings may be, never become the reason another person's good name suffers." Eleanor slowly lowered the letter. Her father's voice echoed somewhere deep inside her memory. "A good heart sometimes means walking away before someone asks you to." She looked around the library, the room where she and Adrian had shared so many quiet afternoons, the room that no longer felt empty. The realization struck with painful clarity. She had forgotten who she was. Not Eleanor Whitmore, a schoolmaster's daughter, a paid companion. And Adrian was the Duke of Ashcombe. Every newspaper in England watched his life. Every noble family expected him to marry within his own world. She had never intended to stand between him and that future. Yet perhaps she already had that a gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Lady Charlotte entered carrying a small book. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Eleanor quickly folded the letter. "Not at all." Charlotte noticed the sadness in her expression immediately. "You received bad news." Eleanor attempted a smile. "Only a reminder." "Of what?" "That fairy tales belong in books." Charlotte remained silent for a long moment. Then she quietly sat beside her. "My mother spent years hoping Adrian and I would marry." Eleanor looked surprised. "I know." "No." Charlotte smiled gently. "You know that she hoped. You don't know how Adrian felt. He never once gave me reason to believe he loved me. He respected me. He cared for me. But love... She shook her head softly. Love always looks different. Eleanor lowered her eyes. I think I've stayed here too long. Charlotte understood immediately. No, you've only just arrived. That evening, Eleanor packed her suitcase, the same small suitcase with which she had arrived. It took less than 10 minutes. She folded the blue gown the Dowager Duchess had given her, placed it carefully on the bed. She could not take it. It belonged to another daughter, not her. Then she wrote a letter. Your Grace, thank you for showing kindness to someone who arrived here with nothing. Ashcombe Manor gave me more peace than I believed possible. But peace should never come at the cost of another person's future. Please forgive me for leaving without saying goodbye. Some departures are easier when no one watches. With deepest gratitude, Eleanor Whitmore. A single tear landed upon the paper. She quickly brushed it away. No, she whispered to herself. Don't make this harder. As Eleanor quietly crossed the corridor carrying her suitcase, the Dowager Duchess stepped from her sitting room. She stopped, looked at the suitcase, then at Eleanor's face. You've decided. Eleanor nodded. I must. My dear, the older woman's voice broke. Has anyone asked you to leave? No. Then why? Because no one should have to. Silence filled the corridor. The Duchess walked forward, took Eleanor's hands in her own. You've brought life back into this house. I brought gossip. I don't care about gossip. But Adrian will. He deserves peace. The older woman's eyes filled with tears. So do you. At exactly the same moment, Adrian entered the library carrying a new edition of Tennyson's poems. He had noticed Eleanor admiring it in the village bookshop 2 days earlier. He intended to leave it quietly on the table, without mentioning where it had come from. The room stood empty. Only one letter rested upon the armchair where Eleanor usually sat. His name appeared upon the front. A cold feeling settled in his chest. He broke the seal. Read the first line. Then the second. The book slipped from his hand. It struck the wooden floor with a dull sound. Atlas lifted his head immediately. The Duke read the letter again. Then once more. His hands trembled. For the first time since William disappeared, he knew exactly what fear felt like. Not the fear of losing someone. The fear of realizing you might already have. He reached Eleanor's bedroom only moments later. The door stood open. The fire still burned. Fresh flowers remained upon the windowsill. The blue gown rested neatly folded across the bed. Everything else was gone. Mrs. Hargreaves appeared in the hallway. Your Grace, when 5 minutes ago, Mr. Collins is preparing a carriage. Adrian looked toward the front staircase. No, she'll walk. She never wastes money. Without another word, he turned and ran. The servants watched in stunned silence. The Duke of Ashcombe was running, not because duty demanded it, not because danger threatened, but because somewhere beyond the manor gates, the woman who had quietly brought spring back into his life was walking away. The autumn wind carried golden leaves across the long country road. Eleanor walked alone. Her small leather suitcase felt heavier with every passing mile, not because of its weight, because every step carried her farther from the only place that had felt like home since her father's death. She refused to look back. If she looked back, she knew she would never leave. The morning sun had climbed higher, painting the distant hills with warm shades of gold. Birds sang from the ancient oak trees lining the road. Everything around her seemed peaceful. Only her heart remained unsettled. She whispered quietly to herself, "You made the right decision." The words sounded convincing. They simply didn't feel true. Back at Ashcombe Manor, Adrian crossed the courtyard at a pace no one had ever witnessed before. Stable boys hurried to prepare his horse. Mr. Collins stepped forward. "Your Grace, the carriage will be ready in a moment." "I don't want the carriage." "The black stallion." Immediately, within seconds, Storm, Adrian's favorite horse, was brought forward. Atlas and Orion were already waiting. Neither dog needed commands. They knew exactly where they were going. The Duke mounted in one smooth motion. Before anyone could speak, Storm galloped through the open gates. The wolves raced beside him. Mrs. Hargreaves watched until they disappeared down the long tree-lined drive. The Dowager Duchess quietly joined her. He loves her. Mrs. Hargreaves smiled through her tears. Yes, I believe he finally does. Nearly 2 miles from the manor, Eleanor heard the sound of galloping hooves. At first she ignored it. Country roads were often busy during harvest season. The sound grew louder, closer. Then someone called her name. Eleanor. She stopped walking. Very slowly, she turned. Storm came to a halt only a few yards away. Adrian climbed down almost before the horse had stopped moving. Atlas reached her first. The giant wolfhound rested his head against her hand, exactly as he had on the day they met. Orion leaned quietly against her side. Eleanor smiled sadly. I suppose you come to say goodbye. The Duke looked at the suitcase, then at the road stretching endlessly ahead. No, I've come to ask you not to go. For several moments, neither spoke. The autumn breeze moved gently through the trees. Golden leaves drifted between them. Eleanor finally lowered her eyes. You shouldn't have followed me. I couldn't let you leave. You can. No. His answer came so quickly that it surprised even him. She looked up. There will be gossip. I know. People will judge you. They already do. You deserve someone from your own world. Adrian smiled faintly. My own world. He looked back toward Ashcombe Manor in the distance. I've spent 4 years living in a house full of rooms. He looked into her eyes. You were the first person who ever made it feel like a home. Eleanor felt tears gathering despite every effort to stop them. She shook her head. You don't understand. No, I understand perfectly. He took one slow step closer. When you arrived, I thought my dogs had made a strange mistake. They hadn't. They simply recognized something I was too blind to see. She whispered softly, What do they see? The Duke smiled. Someone who asked for nothing. Someone who expected nothing. Someone who brought laughter back to my mother. Music back to the servants. Life back to the garden. He paused. And hope. Back to me. A single tear escaped down her cheek. I've already lost everyone I've ever loved. My parents. My home. My future. She looked away. I don't think I could survive losing another. Adrian answered quietly. You won't. You can't promise that. No, I can't. He moved another step closer. But I can promise something else. She looked at him again. I won't walk away. No matter how difficult tomorrow becomes. Silence settled between them. Not awkward, simply honest. For the first time, neither was hiding behind titles, or duty, or fear. They were simply Adrian and Eleanor. The old oak tree beside the road had stood there for hundreds of years. Its branches stretched high above them, the same tree beneath which generations of travelers had rested. Adrian reached into his coat, not for a ring, not yet. Instead, he removed a small leather-bound book, the copy of Tennyson's poems Eleanor had admired in the village. She looked surprised. You bought it. I intended to leave it quietly in the library, so you wouldn't know. She laughed through her tears. You really are terrible at surprises. So I've been told. She accepted the book carefully, opening the first page. Inside, he had written only one sentence. Wherever this book is read, I hope it is beside me. She closed it slowly. You wrote that? I did. It sounded much better in my head. She smiled. No, it sounded exactly right. The wind became still. Even Atlas and Orion sat quietly beneath the oak tree, almost as though they understood this moment belonged only to two people. Adrian looked at Eleanor with a calm certainty she had never seen before. My mother once told me that love arrives quietly. I never believed her. I expected certainty. Thunder. Something impossible to ignore. He shook his head. Instead, it arrived carrying one small suitcase. It spent mornings rescuing forgotten roses. It filled the library with peaceful silence. And somehow, it rescued me without ever trying. He gently took both her hands. Eleanor Whitmore, I cannot promise you a perfect life. I cannot promise that sorrow will never return. But I can promise that you will never again face it alone. He took a slow breath. Then, for the first time in years, the Duke of Ashcombe spoke the words his heart had carried for weeks. I love you. I think I have loved you from the day Atlas placed his head in your lap. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. I love you too. I was simply too frightened to admit it. A smile spread across Adrian's face. The kind of smile no portrait painter had captured in years. There is one more question. She laughed softly. I thought there might be. He knelt beneath the ancient oak tree. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. Inside rested a delicate sapphire ring, surrounded by tiny diamonds. Not extravagant, elegant, timeless. Eleanor Whitmore, will you do me the greatest honor becoming my wife? And the Duchess of Ashcombe? She looked at him, then at the wolves. Atlas wagged his tail. Orion gave a contented sigh. She laughed through her tears. I don't think they're going to let me say no. They're rather persuasive. She nodded. Yes, Adrian. I will. The journey back to Ashcombe Manor felt shorter somehow. Eleanor rode beside Adrian upon Storm. Atlas and Orion ran happily ahead. As the manor finally appeared beyond the trees, every servant stood waiting on the front steps. No one had planned it. No one had given orders. They had simply gathered. The Dowager Duchess descended the steps before the horse had fully stopped. She looked from Adrian to Eleanor, then to the sapphire ring. Without a single word, she embraced Eleanor tightly. My dear, she whispered, welcome home. Across the gardens, the old white rose named Hope swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and beside it, several new buds had begun to bloom. For the first time in 4 long years, Ashcombe Manor no longer looked like a house waiting for someone to return. It looked like a home where a new beginning had finally arrived. Winter arrived quietly. Unlike the years before, Ashcombe Manor did not fear it anymore. The stone walls remained the same. The sea still crashed endlessly against the northern cliffs. The wind still carried the scent of salt through ancient gardens. Yet something had changed. The house no longer felt empty. Its silence was no longer born of grief. It had become the peaceful silence of a family finally learning how to breathe again. Snow covered the countryside like a soft white blanket. Christmas approached. Ashcombe Manor glowed with hundreds of candles reflected in every window. Garlands of pine decorated the grand staircase. Fresh holly hung above every doorway. Laughter echoed through corridors that had once known only whispers. Mrs. Doyle argued cheerfully with the cooks over the Christmas pudding. Mr. Collins pretended not to notice the stable boys sneaking warm pastries from the kitchen. Even Mrs. Hargreaves smiled more than she scolded. The servants often whispered the same words. Miss Whitmore changed everything. Mr. Collins always corrected them. No, the Duke did. He simply needed someone to remind him how. Spring arrived early that year. The first roses bloomed nearly 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Mr. Fletcher stood in the garden before sunrise, staring in disbelief. The white rose named Hope had become the largest bush in the entire garden. Around it, hundreds of roses had awakened. Crimson, ivory, soft pink, golden yellow. Fragrance filled the morning air. The forgotten garden had returned. Mr. Fletcher quietly removed his hat. Looking toward the sky, he whispered, "You kept your promise, young master." Inside the manor, excitement filled every room. Maids hurried through hallways carrying ribbons and flowers. The chapel bells could already be heard across the estate. Guests had begun arriving from neighboring villages. Not only noble families, but gardeners, stable hands, school children, widows the Dowager had supported for years. The Duke had insisted, if they helped build this home, they belong at our wedding. No one argued. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedroom. Her wedding gown was beautifully simple. Ivory silk, long lace sleeves, tiny pearls embroidered around the neckline. No diamonds, no heavy jewels. She wanted nothing to distract from the promise she was about to make. The Dowager Duchess quietly entered. For several moments, she simply looked at Eleanor, then smiled through tears. My son always believed beautiful things needed grand decorations. She adjusted Eleanor's veil. Then he met you. Eleanor laughed softly. I think he still enjoys beautiful things. He does. The Duchess gently placed a small velvet box into Eleanor's hands. It belonged to my husband. Inside rested a tiny sapphire brooch. My wedding gift. Eleanor's eyes filled. I don't deserve this. My dear. The older woman kissed her forehead. You stopped being my companion the day you became my daughter. Outside the chapel, Adrian stood beside the old oak tree where he had proposed months earlier. Storm grazed peacefully nearby. Atlas and Orion rested quietly at his feet. Mr. Collins adjusted the Duke's tie. You appear nervous, sir. I am. I've negotiated with ministers. I've addressed Parliament. I've managed an estate larger than some kingdoms. The old butler smiled. And I've never been this frightened. Mr. Collins chuckled. That means you've chosen well. The chapel doors opened. Every guest stood. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows. The violin began playing a gentle melody. Instead of flower girls, Atlas and Orion walked slowly down the aisle. The giant wolfhounds carried tiny baskets of white rose petals attached to elegant blue ribbons. Children laughed softly. Even the bishop smiled. The wolves reached Adrian first. Atlas sat proudly beside him. Orion looked toward the entrance, waiting. Then Eleanor appeared. The entire chapel fell silent. She wasn't the most richly dressed bride anyone had ever seen. She was simply radiant, the kind of beauty born not from jewels, but from kindness. As she walked toward Adrian, he forgot every guest around him, forgot the music, forgot the ceremony. All he could see was the woman who had quietly transformed his life. When she finally reached him, he whispered, "You look beautiful." She smiled. "So do you?" The bishop cleared his throat politely. Soft laughter filled the chapel. The ceremony remained wonderfully simple. No grand speeches, no elaborate traditions, only promises. When it came time for Adrian to speak his vows, he looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. "Eleanor, I once believed love belonged to other people. I believed my happiest days had ended. You proved me wrong. You taught me that grief may shape a heart, but it never has the right to close it forever. I promise to choose you every morning, to stand beside you in every season, to laugh with you, to grow old with you, and should winter ever return, I promise we shall face it together." Many guests quietly wiped away tears. Eleanor smiled through her own. When her turn came, she gently held both his hands. "Adrian, you never rescued me. You welcomed me. You gave me a home before you ever offered me your name. I promise to fill every room with kindness, to protect your peace as faithfully as you protected mine, to remind you, whenever life becomes difficult, that even forgotten gardens bloom again. I choose you today, and every tomorrow God grants us." The bishop smiled warmly. Then, by the authority entrusted to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Applause filled the little chapel. Atlas barked once. Orion wagged his tail so enthusiastically that several children burst into laughter. That afternoon, the wedding celebration moved into the restored rose garden. Long wooden tables stretched beneath flowering arches. Children played between the fountains. Musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies. Mr. Fletcher quietly approached Adrian. "Your Grace." The Duke turned. The old gardener pointed toward the center of the garden. The white rose named Hope had opened completely. Its petals shone brilliantly beneath the spring sun. Beside it, a small wooden sign had appeared. No one knew who placed it there. Upon it were carved only a few words. Some promises simply take longer to bloom. Adrian looked toward the sky. Somewhere, he imagined his younger brother smiling. Ashcombe Manor no longer felt like the lonely estate travelers whispered about. The library was rarely empty. The music room echoed with piano melodies every evening. The Harvest Festival returned as an annual tradition. The Rose Garden became famous throughout Northumberland. Visitors traveled for miles simply to see it. And every morning, the Duke and Duchess could be found walking its winding paths together, always followed by two enormous Irish wolfhounds. Atlas had grown older. Orion's muzzle had begun turning gray. Yet neither ever walked far from Eleanor. Some habits were forever. Many years later, a little girl with dark curls ran laughing through the rose garden. Behind her hurried two aging wolfhounds, trying very hard to pretend they could still keep up. Evelyn, Eleanor called. Slow down. The child stopped beside the old white rose. Mother, why is this one different? Eleanor knelt beside her, because it reminds our family that hope never disappears. It only waits. The little girl looked thoughtfully at the flower, then toward her father, who was smiling from beneath the old oak tree. Is that why Papa smiles now? Eleanor looked at Adrian. He caught her eyes from across the garden. The same smile, the same warmth, the same quiet love. She nodded gently. Yes, I think that's exactly why. The evening sun slowly disappeared beyond the cliffs. The sea continued singing its endless song. Ashcombe Manor stood proudly against the fading light, no longer remembered as a house that had forgotten how to smile, but as a place where two lonely hearts discovered that love does not always arrive with great fanfare. Sometimes it arrives carrying one small suitcase, a handful of books, a quiet smile, and the courage to believe that even the most forgotten gardens can bloom again